Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'll try not to speak too quickly. My topic today is Heutagogy, preparing learners for life after education. And I want to apologize for those of you who have sat through many of my presentations about Heutagogy because some of the slides are reused, some of them are not new, but I need to get everyone on the same page so that we have common ground to work from. So, first I want to talk a little bit about the forces that we're confronted with today within higher education and industry, and what that means for us as educators. The first force, the first thing that is challenging is our students need jobs. So they're going into higher education not necessarily to learn, but to get the credentials in order for them to work within industry. So there needs to be, of course, as all of you know, a good relationship between industry and education in order to ensure that students will be able to up and run when they get into the workforce. Now, my background, I was not always in academia. My first job was with SAP in Waldorf, and I joined SAP in 1990, and at that time the company had about 1,000 employees. And the only people that they were hiring at that time, which was a directive from our board of directors, were doctors of physics, right? So we would get really, really smart people. There was somebody in here that was physics, wasn't there? Yeah. You could get a job at SAP. And so they would come in, and it always amazed me because I was part of this hiring process, which was a massive, I mean, SAP has almost 90,000 employees now. At that point, we were, 1,000. So there was, just always amazed me, there would be some employees that would come in and they'd be like the road runner. They just hit the ground running. They knew what they needed to do. They jumped in. They were fully, involved. They were fully engaged. And then there were those that came in and waited for somebody to tell them what they had to do. And they weren't going to make any decisions until someone did that. And those were the ones that we needed a lot of time to upskill, a lot of time to get them on board. And so this was something that always intrigued me. Why is it that my employees, why is it some of them, they're all very intelligent, why is it that some of them are ready to be, they're in their jobs, they're productive from day one or day two, and then there's those that take forever to get into the system, to adapt to change, to adapt to this new environment. And I'm going to go into why I then explored Heutagogy as a potential solution to that. This over here is a Wordle that I put together with skills that employers are looking for in the 21st century, based on research from Prensky, Thomas and Brown, Trilling, and Fatal. So these are all things that we want to have in our employees. So how do we get there? How do we get to the point where our students have these skills when they enter the workforce? Learning is for life, okay? When I talk to students, I often will say to them, do you remember, do you know this technology? Do you remember the analog phone when we didn't use push buttons? When we actually only used a phone to call people and talk to them on the telephone, okay? And many of our students today, they have no concept of this. They probably wouldn't even know how to use an analog phone in some cases. There's a really good YouTube video on that. Some kids trying to use an analog phone and they can't figure out how it works. Learning is for life, and I have this example of a doctor, because doctors need to be, they need to keep up on all of the changes. They can't just come out of med school and say, okay, I'm a doctor, give it to me. I can be a doctor. I don't have to learn anything else. So there's this constant ongoing learning process, and we have to be able to educate our students so that they are ready to learn for life. Students not thinking for themselves. This particular incident really struck me last year. There was professors from Princeton, from Yale, Penn State University, Harvard, who wrote an open letter to all of the new students coming into their universities and to students returning, saying, think for yourself. Okay, you need to start thinking for yourself. Don't take the word of what your professors are saying. And when I heard that, when I read that, I thought, wow, how did we get to that point? How did we get to the point where we have to tell students to think for themselves? Shouldn't this be something that they're doing anyway? So what can we do about it? Well, there's different approaches, okay? And I want you to think a little bit first about how you learn to do things, okay? Do you, when you want to learn something, do you go into a lecture and listen to someone tell you how to do something or what to do, right? Riding a bicycle. How many of you went into a lecture to learn how to ride a bicycle? Okay? So this is just an example. People want to learn by doing. When I teach my students in the master's program, I ask them at the beginning of the course, how do you like to learn? What's your favorite way to learn? And they say, I want to learn by doing. I want to do it myself in over 80% of the cases. So, but what we usually do is we usually do didactic pedagogy. Chalk and talk is the phrase that we use in English. Standing in front, like I'm doing right now, and telling you about a topic, okay? Andragogy comes from Malcolm Knowles, and Malcolm Knowles thought adults learn differently than children do. So we need to have a different approach to the way that we teach adults than the way that we teach children. So this is just a quick definition of that. And what I want to talk to you about is Heutagogy, which is an extension of andragogy, and it's self-determined learning. Heutagogy is interesting. It's the word comes from the Greek self and self-reflection. And it's interesting because people discuss, well, how do you pronounce it? Do you pronounce it Heutagogy? Do you pronounce it Heutagogy? In German, heute means today. So I always tell people it's the pedagogy of today. So what is Heutagogy? This is a definition from Haza and Kenyon, who came up with the theory back in 2000 in Australia. And it's basically self-determined learning, applying a holistic approach to developing learner capabilities, with the learner serving as the major agent. Learner agency is central to Heutagogy. Heutagogy comes from a long line of different theories that are learner-centered. Yeah? Theories such as behaviorism, constructivism, connectivism is another example, and Dave's going to talk about rhizomatic learning. All of these theories of within education, psychology, social sciences that are learner-centered are what Heutagogy emerges from. So learner agency is central in the sense that the learner defines what they will learn, how they will learn it, and also assessing how they've learned and what they've learned. Capability is the next key principle of Heutagogy, and capability is not the same as competency. Competency is when you can show that you can do something. For example, I can bake a cake. Yeah, my daughter loves to bake bread, so she's competent in baking bread. Capability is when you're able to take those skills and then apply them in a new environment. An example of that, I was in the store with my daughter, and she saw this really healthy bread with all kinds of nuts in it, and she said, I want to make that. So she went on a journey to try to figure out how she would make that bread. And because she had the basic competency of how to bake bread, she was able to actually apply it in a new environment. And so that's what capability would be. Self-efficacy, the more confident you are in what you are doing, the more competent you feel, the more capable you feel. And so self-efficacy is important because we want to build that in our students. Reflection metacognition is another key principle of Heutagogy, and that's reflecting not just on what you've learned and thinking about how does this apply within my environments, how does this apply to my value system, but it's also thinking about the process that you go through in learning and how you've learned. Nonlinear design is another important principle of Heutagogy. we don't have a set curriculum. The curriculum is defined by the student, and so this is not a linear process. People do not learn in linear ways. We jump all over the place when we're learning. So these are some of the key principles of Heutagogy. As I mentioned previously, learner agency, learner is at the center. They're reflecting on what they've learned, they're assessing their development and their progress. They're active, they're self-determined, and they're developing their competencies and capabilities. So the learner is really central to the entire process of learning. You can view this as a pedagogy, andragogy, Heutagogy continuum. There's two schools of thoughts within Heutagogy. One of them is that it's a continuum, it's a process that learners move from pedagogy to andragogy to Heutagogy, that there needs to be a certain level of learner maturity and autonomy before they can practice Heutagogy, that instructor control is quite extensive at the pedagogy didactic level, and it becomes less so as students become more autonomous and more mature in their learning. This is the different principles of Heutagogy and the comparisons. I'm not going to go through this because this will take forever, and so just take a look at that. These are some of the key differences across the three different types or gojis. Okay, so the other school of thought is that Heutagogy is actually something that our children can do at a very young age. And this is my son. He's now 20, and he would be really embarrassed if he knew I was putting this picture up of him. But Stuart Haas argues that that self-determined learning is really characteristic of learners when they're really young. And what happens is we put them into a school system where they're taught that their teachers know best. And their teachers are the one that should be directing their learning and how they learn and what they learn. And Stuart's argument is that young learners can take that responsibility. And it's not a question of maturity. It's really a question of giving them the space to be self-determined, active learners. And this is an example. He was on my case forever, and for those of you who are parents of young children, they all love Playmobil. And he wanted a castle from Playmobil, and I kept saying, Christmas is coming. And one day he just said, I'm tired of this, Mom. You're driving me crazy. I want this castle. So he went up to his room and he built a castle. And this is his castle. And he played with it for weeks. And it saved me time and money. Okay, so why Heutagogy? These are some of the reasons, some of the research-based reasons why Heutagogy has been successful. It improves critical thinking, it engages learners, it helps them have more control over their learning. They start to investigate and question ideas. What?
You may ask questions in the meeting.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah. I'm very interested in your position about this because I first understood Heutagogy like is continued also in age, years old people, and then I found this is more transversal. That it's not andragogy and then adults something.
Exactly.
That Heutagogy and this capacity to self-learn and empower the learner doesn't have to be an adult.
No.
Be a younger. So
no.
It's
exactly.
Okay.
There was, when I was at the Eden Conference in October, I got into a lot of discussions with people after the session that I gave, and we were talking about how this really needs to be a circle, because sometimes I'm a child when I'm learning. I need that knowledge. I need someone that's going to say, this is what, this is the topic, this is the key concepts, the ideas, and then I can move on to the next level. And we're not always at the same place, so it's finding out where your learners are and then scaffolding the process to move them toward more self-determined learning.
So it's about correcting the damage of 20 years.
I do have to say, when I do this in class, my students hate it in the beginning. Totally. They're just like, no. I had a student go to the dean and say, she's not teaching me, and she's supposed to be teaching me. And I was just like, I am teaching you. I'm teaching you to take responsibility for your learning. And the student apologized at the end of the semester and said, you know, I learned more than I ever did in your class because you pushed me out of my comfort zone. And that's what we need to be doing, is pushing them out of their comfort zone to take responsibility, to move out of the box. Because otherwise they're going to end up going into the workplace and their employees or their employers are going to have to teach them that themselves, if they can at all. So how do we do it? Learner-centered environments. This is just some of the things that are characteristic of an environment that's learner-centered. You've got peer learning. Students are creative and innovative. They have an opportunity to take risks and make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And then, of course, we have ICTE. We've got personal learning environments, an opportunity for them to explore. So technology is very important because it offers the affordances to allow students to really explore and learn independently. So what are some of the characteristics of a heutagogic learner? Well, they're autonomous, they're self-directed, self-regulated, self-determined, and really connected. Okay, this is really important, and this, for me, this is where social media comes in. This is the area that I work on, and that's making sure that they can find the information and the resources they need for lifelong learning. And this is not something they should be doing once they get out of college or once they get out of university. They need to be doing this now. They need to start making their connections. They need to start figuring out, where do I find answers to my problems and to my questions? Teacher characteristics. Now for teachers, some people say, well, if I practice heutagogy, then I'm set. I don't have to do anything. The learner does everything. No, that's not the case. Instructors that are practicing heutagogy say that they have to learn even harder than they ever did before, because they're not working from a set toolbox anymore. Their learners are defining what it is that they want to learn, and so their instructors are guiding them, but they also have to keep up on the topics that the learners have chosen. So a lot of times what we get back from the teachers is they say, I had to learn even more in order to support my student and guide them through the process. So, and also what's really important is to be a self-determined learner as well, and because that example means so much to your students. Institutional characteristics. What's the role of the institution in an environment where students assess their own learning? And this is really one of the major stumbling blocks of heutagogy within traditional education, is that these, within the institutions, we can't have it that students define what it is that they're going to learn, and allowing them to assess that learning. And so what are some examples of how that can be done? Learning contracts is one really good example that I know they're practicing in Israel and in Australia. And that's allowing them to define what it is they'll learn and how it will be assessed. But getting around that, who's actually assessing the work, is a challenge. Control is a big issue. Control, the institution wants to control what the students learn and how they learn it. The instructor wants to control what the learner learns, and students don't want to take on the control. They don't want to be responsible in a lot of cases for their learning because it's work. They have to do a lot more than they ever did before, and they just, I mean, I've had students that say, I've learned how to do the system. Yeah, I've learned how to do, I come in, I listen to your lecture, I write down all the notes, I regurgitate that on a test, or I write an essay that fits to your ideas about how things are, and then I move on to the next class and completely forget. If they're engaged and if they have to take responsibility, it's much more possible. The reality is that they'll learn more. So, designing for heutagogy, this is something that Stuart and I put together, an example. Developing a learning contract, learning activities, learning outcomes, assessing those, and you go through a continual process of loops of reflection, of loops of discussion, of loops of feedback, So formative feedback is very important within the process. So what are some examples? I'm just going to run through a couple of examples of Heutagogy being applied at schools, because every time I talk about Heutagogy, I get university people that say, oh yeah, this would really work for like doctoral students, but it would never work in the university. Or I get people that say, well, I can see how this would apply to like the younger grades, but you could never use this in a university. And so, or I can see how it would apply to vocational, but I could never apply this in my school. St. Paul's School, it's a private school in Australia, and it's such a cool school. Yeah, these are 12-year-olds, and it's a big history class, and they were given the mandate from the director of the school that they were to practice self-determined learning within their classrooms. So each student had a contract. They could learn in different ways. They had to achieve a certain goal, and they worked with their instructor on defining what the learning outcomes would be at the end of the semester. And then they were let loose on how to do it, how they would go about it. And they collaborated together on a number of things. A lot of work they did individually. This is the learning space. There was a space for them to work collaboratively. There was a space for them to work online. There was a space for them to just go in a corner and reflect and think. And so what came out of this was something that was really cool. Yeah, they were supposed to study, they decided to study World War II. And what happened was they thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we went out and we interviewed people who were actually in World War II? Right? So they went out and they started to interview people. And when they went to these interviews with people who experienced World War II from the Australian perspective, they started to get a lot of artifacts and memorabilia from them. A lot of older people that wanted to hand it down to the next generation. So they created a museum. Right? These 12-year-old kids created a museum, and they got a portion of the school where they built and replicated what it was like fighting in what's the word?
Trenches.
Trenches, thank you. Fighting in the trenches. And they recreated it based on the discussions they had with people that had been in the war. They had memorabilia from the war. They had the interviews from the war. And then they opened it up to the public. So not only were they learning, but they were giving opportunity to other people to learn as well. So it really had one of those effects when you drop a pebble in the water. Ripple effect, thank you. English really is my first language. So the next example that I have is from K Academic College in Israel. And these guys, the guy who's responsible, K educates, you say, most of the students, the teachers within.
The teachers call it, but it's unique because it's in Beersheba, where part of the population is Jewish, part is Bedouin. It's kind of pretty much both kind of marginalized communities. So it's kind of I think quite the extreme opposite from St. Paul's, if I understood St. Paul's environment in that sense.
Yeah, and what they're doing is they're teaching their teachers to be self-determined learners, and then having their teachers teach their students. And these are very young students. These are students between the ages of like 6 and 10 years old. And the first session that they had with the teachers, they were really skeptical, because the teachers said, there is no way that our little kids can determine their own learning and direct their own learning. It's just not going to be possible, but hey, we'll try it. It did help that the person who was responsible for the program used to be the university president, and he'd been the president for 15 years. So he had a lot of clout. Yeah. So they said, all right, we'll try it, but they were very skeptical about it. And what happened was they started to come back after 8 weeks, and they were astounded. They were like, wow, we are giving our students an opportunity to determine what they're going to learn and how they're going to learn it. And not only can they do this, but they're super motivated and they're really excited about learning. And we never expected this to happen. So they're moving forward in realizing this within the institution in bits and pieces, moving, you know, with smaller projects into larger projects. And they're also working on a book about their experiences in moving into self-determined learning. Whoops, what do I do with that? So, what does a self-determined learning environment look like? It's holistic, meaning you need to have the institutional backing, you need to have the instructor supporting this type of learning, and you need to have students that are open to it and that will take responsibility for their learning. Learners need to be able to have the space to design and create their own learning ecologies. We need to give them a space where they can really define what they want to learn, where they can make mistakes, and where they can move forward in their learning. And we also give them the skills and the tools to make the ecologies their own. So that's my presentation. You didn't give me the 5 minutes.
You're doing great. I was going to say that.